I'm Diane. Welcome to SFN News. Today we have a special treat for you. We have Tom Wolfe with us, a leading activist in recovery in San Francisco. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thank you, Diane. It's great to be here.
I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Tom, I followed Tom's advocacy throughout California for many years, from LA here, the Central California, and the stories of addiction are the same. And I'll let Tom tell you more about it. But first, I want to ask Tom this: what do you mean? I was reading some of your information. What do you mean by half measures avail us nothing?
Well, look, so in recovery, right? One of the lessons that we learn when you go into recovery is that you have to own the things you did in your recovery. And that's kind of the key to your independence or freedom. So when we say half measures is when you try doing things only halfway, like, hey, you're an alcoholic, so you're just going to drink 2 drinks an hour instead of 5 drinks an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you still are struggling with the same disease. It's the same thing with heroin or fentanyl addiction. Well, I'm only going to use once an hour instead of 5 times an hour. Well, you're still struggling with the same disease. And it doesn't really improve your overall health outcome because you haven't addressed the root of why you're using those drugs, which is not only the addiction itself, but the underlying issues that led you to start self-medicating where you fell into addiction. And so when I say half measures avail us nothing, that's really more of kind of a dig at policy too in the state and in San Francisco around the drug crisis, around homelessness. We take all these half measures, we implement kind of this real permissive form of harm reduction for drug users.
Now, what do you mean the permissive form?
Well, so look, one of the cornerstones of recovery is accountability. Okay. And due to criminal justice reforms, the election of certain politicians, previous district attorneys that are no longer in office, that accountability went out the window. And it just all became about carrot and no stick for people that are struggling with substance use disorder and people that are struggling with homelessness that are committing crimes in order to survive in the situation that they are in. And while, look, I was one of those people. And I was homeless in 2018. I was running the streets of the Tenderloin in 2018.
So let me ask you this. You are totally, you have totally been verified as a recovering addict.
Yes.
But when one recovers after having lived in the TL,
Yep.
you have to use everything. You used everything that you knew. You followed suggestions, you took directions. Let me ask you, Tom, what is the Recovery First treatment philosophy and approach?
Well, the Recovery First treatment philosophy is basically a combination or a kind of a meeting point between accountability, opportunity, and compassion, right? We're big on the compassion part, which is, handing out foil pipes and straws to people to use drugs safely, and we'll talk about that.
Yes.
And not holding people accountable in that you're committing crimes to support your addiction, you get off with a slap on the wrist or some kind of diversion. Recovery First is the basic idea that at some point we have to draw a line in the sand and tell people that this is enough. You're not going to cause this chaos on the street anymore while you're slowly killing yourself at the same time.
Right.
So we are going to meet you where you're at and meet you with accountability and compassion, etc.
So let me just interject a question. I will do that from time to time. So when you said the accountability, that suffering addict who has been given the right to decide whether or not they get treatment, but meanwhile, as you mentioned, wreaking havoc on our streets. And so where do they start? What would be their first step?
Well, first of all, there has to be a lot more outreach on the street in regards to where people can access treatment, right?
Okay.
And I think San Francisco has gotten better about that.
Okay.
And they do have a lot of street medicine and outreach workers on the street. But when you start looking at the data that's coming back from those outreach workers, they're meeting people out there on the street, but they're leaving them there like 97% of the time. At a tremendous cost of millions of dollars a year to the city and county of San Francisco. So that we need to work on improving those outcomes. And what does that mean? That means that we have to start giving people a choice out there on the street.
Yes.
The choice is you either come with me, you go to the shelter, or maybe you get involved in the criminal justice system, but whatever it is, you can't stay here and shoot dope on the street corner anymore.
Boy,
right?
there are a lot of San Franciscans that applaud that. Um, so you mentioned about the about accountability, and in San Francisco, the debate between abstinence based and harm reduction approaches to drug recovery, they have intensified, as you know,
Yep.
amidst the ongoing fentanyl crisis.
Yep.
Now, what is your take on that?
It's a pitched ideological battle, is what it is. So it's a battle of ideology. For the harm reduction folks, it's all about the social justice framework and operating under the whole body autonomy framework and idea, and it's become an ideological issue or a philosophical issue on whether or not people who choose to use drugs, even if they're unsheltered, living on the street, should be allowed to do so in plain view in front of children. Okay. For the abstinence-based recovery folks like me and many others, we have a whole coalition in San Francisco. We believe that accountability and opportunity kind of intersect, which means that people out there on the street oftentimes need intervention. And sometimes that intervention has to be law enforcement. Sometimes that intervention has to be an outreach worker. Sometimes that intervention just needs to be, you're going to come with me and we're going to take you to the shelter. We're going to take you to this detox or whatever. And we're going to start you on the process. And what's hard is that the harm reduction people will tell you, well, people have to want to get clean. You can't force them to get clean. That's a bunch of baloney. Look, when I went to rehab, I was there with 90 people. 87 of them were there because the court said you had to be there,
Right.
or you were going to go to prison or jail.
Right.
Right. So they were basically given a choice, and
Right.
they went to treatment. And just like all the other drug treatment programs in the country, about 1/4 of them, or 25%, which is the standard completion rate across every type of drug treatment program in the United States, found recovery.
The great thing about a shelter, many say, is the shelter allows the suffering addict the opportunity to hear the message of recovery. And it requires some accountability. There's some things that they have to do in the shelter. So, shelter versus providing housing.
Right.
So for the average person, they need to explain the difference between, for a suffering addict who cannot make decisions for themselves, obviously, because they're killing themselves, so they can't make healthy decisions. So for the suffering addict, what is housing in terms of its efficacy versus shelters for them?
Well, this is the argument. This is a major argument that's happening across the country right now, because our federal policy towards housing the homeless is under something called Housing First, which theoretically on paper works, and that you make housing really low barrier. You take people that are suffering from a variety of different co-occurring disorders, and you place them in supportive housing with wraparound services available to them voluntarily. Okay. However, where it doesn't seem to be working is for people struggling with addiction or substance use disorder. In San Francisco, 21% of all overdose deaths since 2020. We've had 4,000 overdose deaths since 2020 in San Francisco.
Wow.
21% of them happened in permanent supportive housing. So 1/4 of all our overdose deaths, almost 1/4, are happening inside this supportive housing that's supposed to provide these wraparound services for people that were experiencing homelessness. But it doesn't work for people struggling with drug addiction.
Right.
Those folks need treatment. They need to be in an environment where drugs are not available to them.
Yes.
And the way the law is written in California, drugs are recognized as part of that person's journey when they get placed into that supportive housing, i.e., that means drugs are allowed. And
That's terrible.
yeah, that's state law, Diane.
And I hear people talk about certain political parties have passed this or are advocating that. The disappointment seems to be that it's really not a political issue, it's a humane issue.
I agree.
And how are people that can't take care of themselves expected to take care of themselves? It's like,
I couldn't agree more. So first of all, I'll just look at the camera and say this directly. The drug addiction and homelessness are not a Republican or a Democrat issue. It's a humanitarian crisis. Fentanyl and drug overdoses and homelessness occur in every single state in the union. It's everyone's problem. Everybody has a stake in it. So it would actually be in all of our best interest if we find a way to kind of work through these issues in a bipartisan manner where we're all working together, whether it's the current administration or the previous administration, it shouldn't matter. We should all be finding a way to work together.
That was well stated. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. You- Um, we all need to find a way to work together.
That's
We
right.
can work together, we can accomplish anything.
That's right. And it's like, look, in the recovery community in San Francisco, and I mentioned this to you earlier, and I just want to say it again. It's like, look,
Yeah.
the recovery community in San Francisco is pretty much Black led. It's led from the Black community. There's a lot of people in the Black community that are in recovery from addiction, that have been long-term recovery, like survivors of the crack epidemic,
Yes.
right? That are still here with us,
Yes.
spreading the word of recovery.
Yes.
And they welcome everyone into their fold.
Yes.
Including me
Right.
and everyone else. And we
Right.
all march together as brothers and sisters in
Right.
recovery, and we fight and advocate for change in the city, which is why we have Recovery Day every year in Bodecker Park in the Tenderloin.
Yes.
It's why I had a recovery summit last year. We held a recovery summit last year in San Francisco. We had 500 people, including the mayor, the
Yes.
previous and the current mayor come to that event. It's why we do marches in the street to stop fentanyl, right? That's the recovery community and the recovery coalition in San Francisco leading that charge. And it just goes to show you that addiction itself does not discriminate. Our responses to it might be discriminatory,
Right.
but addiction itself doesn't discriminate, and recovery is for everybody.
Right. Addiction is an equal opportunity
Destroyer.
destroyer.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yes. And on that note, I was very happy to hear you working along with Supervisor Matt Dorsey and some others redefining recovery with long-term remission. And it's a Recovery First ordinance. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this was really the brainchild of Supervisor Dorsey, who he himself is in recovery.
Yes.
And he did a really good job of consulting the recovery community. And as with any other consensus, he couldn't reach agreement for everybody of what language that it would actually say in there. But look, at the end of the day, the long-term remission thing was kind of a nod to the harm reductionist. And I recognize that harm reduction is a set of tools. It just shouldn't be policy. Our policy should be led with recovery, and that's where we are now.
That is so well stated. The policy should be recovery.
That's correct.
We're going to get there with
Yeah.
people like you, people fighting to just enlighten those that have never used. They are setting policy and they don't know anything about addiction.
Yep.
And I think that's why we have the vicious cycle. Would you say?
Absolutely. So look, this is the challenge that I've found as I pivoted my advocacy more into policy work, especially in drug policy. Look, you have a lot of academics that are making decisions and doctors about drug policy, and I respect that. They've studied it. They've worked with patients that have struggled with drug addiction, et cetera. But nobody knows truly the depths of where drug addiction can take you in your life unless you've experienced it yourself. That's why it's super important to have the recovery community have a seat at the table with every policy decision that's made locally, at the state level, at the federal level around drugs, and how we should support, how we should, make our drug policy. Like our drug policy in this country should be led with prevention first.
Right.
Before anything else. And I'm a recovery advocate, but I'm saying it's about prevention first, right? We need to keep our kids away from these drugs that lead to other drugs, that lead to other drugs. And look, I know the ship has sailed on marijuana, so I'm not trying to say anything about that. But what I will say is that kids 15 and under that use marijuana are 9 times more likely to use a harder drug in the future. That's a statistical fact. And so we should talk about prevention, so that we can help kids find a way to deal with their issues without having to self-medicate, regardless of what that is, whether it's alcohol or a harder drug.
That is a good point, because young people aren't being taught to deal with their issues. They're being taught to medicate.
Right.
And the fact that that's even an option is self-destructive.
And it's been that way for a long time. Look, I'm
It
I'm a
has.
child of the 80s. So,
Yeah.
hey, we did our thing in the 80s
Yeah.
too. So I'm not saying that, people aren't going to experiment and try things. So the problem is that now the drugs have become so much more toxic and dangerous
Right.
that when you experiment now, chances are, like, for example,
You're gonna die.
yeah, you're going to overdose, right? So,
Yeah.
like in San Francisco right now, 6 out of 10, out of 60% of all drugs seized on the street by the police are tainted with fentanyl. So meth, crack, cocaine, 6 out of 10 times it has fentanyl in it, and you don't even know, and you're ingesting that drug.
Yeah.
So you're literally playing Russian roulette with your life.
Yes, it is. And as I remember growing up a child of the 70s, and when someone came and peer pressure says, go take this because it's going to get you really high.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the Russian roulette I see with people using,
Right.
because they want to get high and they're willing to take that chance because they don't think it's going to happen to them.
Right.
Now, policy changes. I was glad policy is everything. I saw the policy changes on paraphernalia distribution as part of breaking the cycle, because some believe that in harm reduction, which allows a person to use, how one can use safely is, we'll have harm reduction on to speak about the other side, because we don't understand how there can be harm reduction if a person is killing themselves with drugs.
Yeah, so I think the general philosophy with the harm reduction folks is that these people are going to use drugs whether we like it or not, so we should just support them and provide them with clean equipment to use those drugs so they don't get hepatitis C or HIV or some other disease, right? I understand that concept.
Yeah.
I understand it, right? The thing is, though, is that the reason why drug paraphernalia distribution was restricted from people being able to just go out in the street with a little red wagon and hand out bags of needles and foil and crack pipes and meth pipes to people, was restricted. Now you have to go to a brick and mortar site and talk to somebody about treatment before you accept all that drug paraphernalia, is because these people were going around on carts handing out free pipes to people.
I saw it.
And then someone would ask them, hey, I'm trying to access treatment. Do you know where I can go for treatment? And they'd be like, oh, no, that's not our job. We don't have any information on that.
None.
So you're out there supposedly doing what the harm reductionists call a public health service, but you actually don't have any public health to offer in regards to where people can access detox or treatment. And so they did that to themselves. Mayor Lurie was just reacting to their poor decision of execution of that policy of distributing drug paraphernalia, to the point where the harm reduction people decided that talking to somebody about treatment as you're handing them a meth pipe was actually stigmatizing to the user, which is complete BS. It's not stigmatizing at all. To just be like, hey man, you ready to go to treatment today? How is that stigmatizing?
Right.
You're treating that person with respect and dignity by asking them, do you want to have a chance to get out of this trap that you're stuck in right now?
Breaking the cycle.
Breaking the cycle.
Want to break it.
But they've decided that that's a bad thing. And that's where I have beef with them.
Right.
Because recovery is never a bad thing.
Right.
Talking to someone about getting off the street is never a bad thing.
Right.
Giving someone resources to get off the street is never a bad thing. And so so that had to be, taken down a notch. So props to Mayor Lurie for actually taking that step. Yeah.
Yes, that's a great step, but he has a few more steps to go.
Oh, definitely.
With this harm reduction nightmare. But I'm props to Mayor Lurie, because at least he started.
Yep.
And he's listening to people that know, people like yourself, because if you guys aren't at the table, it's never going to be effective.
Yeah, and again, that's all we ask, is that for a seat at the table, and he's given us that.
Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us on SFN, Tom.
Thank you, Diane. It's my
And
pleasure.
thank you for your wonderful work that you're doing in the community.
Thank you. It's great to
Thank
hear.
you for joining us on another episode of SFN. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.